Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Red Faction 2, released for PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and PC. And while I did originally play through this on the GameCube, what you're going to be seeing here and what I replayed for this Redux is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Red Faction. It was developed by Volition Inc. and published by THQ back in 2002 for PlayStation 2 and the following year for GameCube, Xbox, and PC. And it was generally decently received on the PS2, but less well received on the other systems. The PC version in particular got criticized because it just wasn't a very good port. I mean, it didn't even have online multiplayer or really any multiplayer at all, whereas the console versions at least had split screen. Here, all you can do on PC is bot matches, and you can't even customize your character skin. You're stuck with Alias, unlike on console, where you can change the skin. But even if you set the PC-specific issues aside, there's also issues with the game's design and the very, very short campaign, which clocks in around 3 hours long. Which may not necessarily sound all that weird by modern standards, where the campaigns are more or less an afterthought in most first-person shooters, but back in 2002 and 2003, that was actually a pretty big deal. And with first-person shooters as competitive as they were back then, that was even more of a big deal, because keep in mind, 2002 is the same year we got the likes of No One Lives Forever 2, James Bond Nightfire, Soldier of Fortune 2 Double Helix, Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, and Time Splitters 2. There was some very stiff competition as far as first-person shooters were concerned back then, so Red Faction 2 very much had its work cut out for it. How did they actually pull it off? Well, let's go ahead and start delving into it and see what exactly we're dealing with here and how well it holds up. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which actually ends up looking worse in a lot of ways than the original Red Faction. I mean, sure, the modeling is slightly better, and the animations are more or less on the same quality level, but when you start looking at the textures in particular, a lot of them just look noticeably worse than the original game. There's just less detail in general on that front, and it really does scream that they made this for consoles and then ported it over to PC without taking into consideration any of the advantages that PC had to offer. And to make matters worse in that regard, the PC version is also plagued by the console version's field of view, which is 67.5 degrees. You may think that's a very oddly specific number, and it is. I have absolutely no idea why they chose that particular field of view number, but the end result is quite a lot of nausea, so naturally I went and tried to find a way to modify the field of view, and you can do it. It's just that you have to use an external program to force the field of view to be higher than 67.5, and every single time there's an in-game cutscene, not including the ones that are pre-rendered Bink videos, it actually resets the field of view back to 67.5, and you have to readjust the FOV. Now, of course, field of view options weren't exactly normal in games back then, but you could do it through console commands, which this game does not have. So it ends up being a fairly annoying process. Anyway, regardless of the field of view issues, the visuals in general just don't look good, even for their era, and particularly compared to other games that came out around that time, and even the original Red Faction, and certainly by the time this came out on PC, other games that were releasing in 2003, a lot of the competition not only looked better at the time, but has held up a lot better than Red Faction 2's visuals have. And unfortunately, when you go over to the sound design, things don't really improve all that much. I mean, sure, they do have a pretty decent voice cast in this, with the character Molov being voiced by Lance Henriksen, and Shrike being voiced by Jason Statham, but once you get past some of the star power in the voice cast, the actual lines they're saying are at best ridiculous, but most of the time they just come across as really stilted and awkward, and it just ends up making all of the characters come across as completely one-dimensional and ultimately soulless. And once you move past the really disappointing voice acting, you end up with sound effects that mostly sound like they came right out of a stock sound library with minimal changes, if any. And the soundtrack is either just reused from the original Red Faction, which is fine because the original Red Faction had good music, but unfortunately the new stuff is just bland and uninteresting too. And it certainly doesn't help that there are some issues with the mixing, making the volume of effects versus voices and music really awkwardly balanced, and the actual sound effects themselves tend to cut out quite a lot. So when you bring all of the presentation together, it just ends up being a mess. But of course, as much of a mess as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and those can more than make up for the presentation if they're good, right? Well, let's go ahead and start talking about the story, because there's honestly not a whole lot to talk about here. Like I said, the game is about 3 hours long. Actually, that's being optimistic. I finished it in about 2.5 hours. So what exactly does that 2.5 to 3 hours of gameplay entail? Well, the game takes place about 5 years after the events of the original Red Faction, and the nanotechnology that came up in the campaign of that has made its way to Earth. And it is precisely there that any association with Red Faction 1 ends, because even though there is a so-called Red Faction in this, it doesn't have anything to do with the Red Faction on Mars, and in fact, the only thing that ties the two games together is the nanotechnology. So anyway, the nanotechnology falls into the hands of Chancellor Sopot, the leader of the Commonwealth, and what does he do with it? Well, he creates a group of nanotechnology-enhanced super soldiers, of which you play one of the members, a guy named Alias, who is their demolitions expert. And Sopot uses his newfound power to assert full control over the Commonwealth and create a military dictatorship. And once Sopot's control has been cemented, he grows fearful of the technology and ends up trying to hunt down and kill all of the super soldiers, which in turn, of course, causes the super soldiers to feel betrayed and ultimately shack up with the Red Faction and try to take down Sopot's dictatorship. Now, the setup may sound perfectly fine to you if you're familiar with the original Red Faction. I mean, in that game you had a tyrannical corporation controlling the miners on Mars, it treated them like absolute garbage, and eventually you just hit the boiling point and the rebellion starts. Well, the problem with the setup for that in Red Faction 2 is that it haphazardly throws everything at you in a very brief intro cutscene and basically says that you are here to fight Chancellor Sopot, not so much because he's a tyrannical dictator and because the people are suffering for it, but because he betrayed you, and so you're out to get revenge. I mean, sure, the members of the Red Faction are fighting for freedom, but you're not one of them. Sure, you fight alongside them for a lot of the game, but you're not actually a member of the Red Faction. You're just a member of this super soldier squad that was betrayed. And you and your squad, frankly, don't give a crap about the goals that the Red Faction is trying to achieve. In fact, Molov, your squad leader, outright says that the Red Faction are a bunch of wimps and that you should just completely ignore them as much as you possibly can, except where it suits you to continue on to the next objective. But it gets worse from there, and in order to fully explain why it gets worse, I have to put up a spoiler warning, because I will be spoiling the entire story of Red Faction 2. Not that it has much of a story, but you have been warned. I'll have a time code you can skip forward to if you want to avoid spoilers. So now that those of you who have been warned have had an ample opportunity to skip, let's talk about the main story of the game, because it's not actually taking down Sopot. That is barely half of the game. And really, it's just set up for the actual story of the game, where Alias is betrayed by half of his squad, particularly Molov, the squad leader, who is obsessed with creating a strength-based society where he will use the nanotechnology that Sopot had hidden to create even more enhanced super soldiers, and this new army of super soldiers is obviously bigger and badder and tougher and more awesome than Alias is, and he'll use them to take over the world and crush any who oppose him. Yeah, Molov's a cartoon villain, and his plans are not only incredibly stupid, but they are so transparent that you could probably see the twist coming from a mile away, which is impressive considering that it does basically come out of nowhere with absolutely no setup whatsoever. And you may be thinking, but DW, there was clearly some sort of setup, right? No, there wasn't. The entire time up to that point, Molov was just telling you that you need to take down Sopot, and that's all that really matters. And then you do take down Sopot. In fact, you set him on fire and he runs around screaming like a maniac. And then the very next thing that happens is Alias goes back to the Red Faction base and finds the Red Faction massacred, finds Molov sitting at the desk just looking like a villain and being like, Sup, dude? The Commonwealth military's sworn loyalty to me, and I got this nanotech, so I basically rule the world now, and if you're not with me, you're against me. Obviously, Alias takes some umbrage with them slaughtering their allies, and that immediately sets him against the entire rest of the squad, except for Tangier and eventually Shrike. And thus, your objective changes from toppling a military dictatorship under Sopot to toppling a military dictatorship under Molov. But not because it's the right thing to do, not because you're a freedom fighter, but because you've been betrayed. Again! And while Tangier is constantly saying that you need to stop Molov from using that nanotech because the nanotech is just too dangerous and you can't let anybody else use it, that's really just used as a convenient excuse to try to make this something more than just a revenge story. But it's really just a revenge story. And it's a really awful revenge story at that, because nothing is set up well and everything is supremely rushed. It's like they tried to make the campaign have a sense of urgency and give it a breakneck pace, but while they did manage to give it a breakneck pace, but it's at the cost of anything that could make you possibly give a crap about what you're actually doing. There is absolutely no world building in this game at all, and no, propaganda posters do not count as world building. They might help reinforce world building if you were actually able to, oh, I don't know, see what life in the Commonwealth is like beyond, hey, you're a super soldier who's been betrayed, and by the way, there's these Red Faction guys that are fighting for freedom or something or other, but it doesn't really matter to you. I mean, hell, the original Red Faction wasn't exactly a work of art in its story department, or especially its characters, but it at least set things up properly. It was like, these are what the conditions are like for people who work at the Ultor Corporation on Mars. And then you start the game, and it's just a day gone wrong that spirals out of control. And throughout the rest of the game, you get to see exactly why the Ultor Corporation needs to be stopped, and why the Red Faction is doing what it's doing. Meanwhile, in Red Faction 2, they're background characters. You don't care what they're doing because all that matters to you is taking down Sopot and then the rest of your revenge plot. About the closest thing you get to an actual reason that Sopot needs to be taken down is something called the Processed, which are basically zombies. Yep, Sopot replaced his nano-enhanced super soldiers with zombies, and that's pretty much it. And sure, that's evil, and Sopot is clearly a madman and needs to be stopped. But that's not why you're doing what you're doing in Red Faction 2. You're not even introduced to the process until later on in the game, and by the time that happens, you're already in open warfare with Sopot's forces anyway, so it's not like it actually has any real bearing on the story. And then, of course, after the halfway point, it doesn't matter anyway, because then you're on to fighting another cartoonish villain with cartoonish villain motivations, and it's all because you were betrayed again. So between the story being an absolute dumpster fire and the characters being completely one-note, one-dimensional cardboard cutouts, it is impossible to give a single solitary crap about anything that actually goes on in the campaign other than just the raw gameplay. So what is the gameplay of Red Faction 2 like? Well, it is a first-person shooter, and it has seen some noticeable changes from the original Red Faction. Unlike in that game, you do not have weapon categories anymore, you just have a single long list of weapons that you can scroll through. So while you haven't lost the ability to carry all of the weapons, you have lost some of the convenience of being able to switch between them more quickly. Much like in the original game, most of the weapons have alternate fires of some description, although the heavy machine gun in this no longer has the slow fire as its alternate fire, it only has one fire mode now. And obviously, some alternate fires are going to be more useful than others. For example, if you run around using the alternate fire of the basic pistols, you're just pistol whipping people, and that's pretty much useless. Whereas the alternate fire on the NICW is actually a grenade launcher, so you're going to be using that an awful lot. And while the weapons in Red Faction 2 mostly look completely different from the ones in the original game, they do still occupy mostly the same roles. For example, the assault rifle in this now looks more like an AK, but the functionality is still the same. It's burst fire with the primary and full auto with the secondary. Some of the weapons have been removed, like the fusion rocket launcher and the stun baton and the riot shield, but then other weapons have also been added, like the anti-personnel weapon, which basically just shoots out a whole bunch of grenades all at once, or the grenade launcher, or a couple of different types of machine pistols, and some of those weapons can actually be dual-wielded, specifically the ones that you can hold in one hand, like the pistols and the machine pistols. They did, however, completely nerf the shotgun, because now it looks absolutely terrible, and the primary fire is a pretty much useless semi-automatic function that barely seems to do any damage, and you basically have to shove down an enemy's throat to actually do anything with. And the secondary fire is a pump-action incendiary shell that is definitely a bit more effective, but it's rather slow to fire, and it's also very short range. Meanwhile, the precision rifle got nerfed in terms of damage, but they dramatically increased the amount of ammunition it has. The railgun actually got more rounds in the magazine than just one, although the thermal scope is no longer a thermal scope, it just has rings that show up where an enemy is, so it's considerably less cool than the original game's railgun. And in fact, the whole thermal scope thing in general is just not really a thing anymore. There's no thermal readouts on the rocket launcher or anything like that, so they have noticeably less detail in the arsenal in this particular game than they did in the original game, and it just ends up making the weapons a bit less interesting. But it seems like as a bit of a compensating factor, they put in giblets, so you can now blast enemies with explosives and they will explode into meaty chunks, which they didn't do in the original game, so that's a thing. Although a lot of times you barely even notice it, because when I say explode into meaty chunks, I mean basically 1 or 2 chunks. And it's really not satisfying at all. Hell, a lot of the time you can't even really tell that you're actually hitting enemies because there's not really much noticeable impact on them until they just fall over. It's not like in the original game where there were noticeable blood puffs whenever you actually hit something. And all of the poor feedback combined with the weapon's inherent inaccuracy, where unless it's a precision weapon like the precision rifle or the sniper rifle or the railgun, you're having to deal with cone of fire mechanics where the crosshair does not indicate that you are seeing any real spread, but you are noticing that your rounds are just not going where you're aiming, and it's most noticeable on the fully automatic weapons, in particular the machine pistols, especially when you dual wield them, all combined together to make the weapons just not satisfying to use, and ultimately actually pretty weak, all things considered. Unless you're constantly getting headshots or using some of the more powerful weapons like the sniper rifle or the explosive weapons, you're gonna notice that it takes quite a few shots to bring enemies down, and they can be rather bullet spongy, so a lot of your arsenal just ends up being fairly underpowered. Despite this, however, you're going to find that the vast majority of the game is a complete pushover in terms of difficulty. The enemy AI is rather dumb, and about the only intelligent thing they do is trying to get out of your direct line of fire, and by that I mean they'll move back and forth, and that's pretty much it. And sure, that's kind of what happened with the AI in the original Red Faction, but it ended up working out better in that game because they could actually hit you more often and do quite a lot more damage, and you didn't have regenerating health in that game like you do in this. In fact, the health system in general is one of the biggest contributing factors to making most of the game a complete pushover, because now you have a health bar instead of a health meter and an armor meter like in the original game, and as you continue to take damage, obviously your health bar goes down. If it bottoms out, if you have a health kit in your inventory, then you use one of those, and it is immediately replenished all the way back up to full. And if you find one of those health kits laying on the ground and you've taken some damage, but it hasn't kicked in with the regenerating health yet, once you walk over that health kit, you'll pick it up and instantly replenish your health back to full as well. But the thing is, you don't even really need to do that. As long as there's no enemies around and you're not in direct combat, eventually your health will start automatically regenerating with a really really loud, obnoxious noise playing in the background as it does so. You can just tank a pretty ludicrous amount of damage before it actually starts to become a problem, and in fact, there's only one instance in the entire game where I actually ended up dying, and that was the final boss fight, which puts you up against a guy in a mech suit, and the mech suit is able to constantly fire without interruption, meaning that you are constantly taking damage, and therefore cannot heal with the automatic health regen. And of course, the mech suit takes absolutely forever to bring down, so by the time you do manage to do that, and he's on the ground running around outside of the mech suit in phase 2 of the fight, you're already pretty much at no health anyway, and he's still able to hit you, so it ends up being a pretty obnoxious fight, where you just have to get lucky with the amount of damage you do versus the amount of damage he does. It's just a battle of attrition. That's not challenging, that's not difficult, it's just boring. Of course, the even worse part about this whole mess is that the health system changes also came with the removal of feedback for getting hit. I mean, sure, there's an indicator that pops up on screen, but it is barely noticeable, and it certainly does not tell you how much damage you're actually taking. You just have to keep an eye on the health bar the entire time. And of course, since this was a console game and it was ported over to PC quite badly, there's no save anywhere feature. I mean, you can hit the save progress button, but it only saves up to the last checkpoint, so what's the point of even having it in the first place? And it has the potential to become pretty annoying if you do somehow end up dying at some point in the levels and have to start back over from the last checkpoint, because a lot of these checkpoints are right before completely unskippable in-game cutscenes. All of the cutscenes that are rendered in-game are unskippable, but in a move that makes absolutely no sense at all of the Bink videos, the pre-rendered videos, actually are skippable, so I don't know what they were thinking in that regard, but it's certainly pretty annoying. Anyway, that particular tangent aside, as you continue through the game, you will notice numerous bonus objectives come up, and these will normally involve destroying some additional target on top of what you're already destroying, but the thing is, they're already in the way as you're continuing through the level anyway, so there's not much reason not to do them, but they also don't really have any bearing on what you're actually doing, so there's also not a reason to do them. So that ends up being a pretty odd decision on the developer's part, and speaking of odd decisions, it's also odd that they tout being able to get into vehicles, and as it turns out, almost every single time you're in a vehicle in this game, it's a turret section. The ones where it's not, you're just in a suit of battle armor, which is basically just a bipedal mech, or you're in a submarine. These sections do help to give the game some variety, but they're certainly not as extensive as the sections where you would do those sorts of things in the original Red Faction, and with the game being as incredibly short as it is, they really don't do enough. So for the most part, the campaign just ends up being a bust, and it certainly doesn't help that they implemented a very pathetic excuse of a multiple ending system, which is based on something called your heroism score, and the only thing you can do with that is to not kill civilians. As long as you don't kill civilians, your heroism score doesn't go down, and ultimately you'll get the best ending. The thing is, the game doesn't do a remotely good enough job of explaining how that works, so you probably won't even know that there are multiple endings available in the game anyway, unless you just read that bit on the back of the box. This means that you might be playing through the game and notice a red indicator pop up on one side of the screen, and you just won't know what that's for, and by the end of the game, you'll end up with one of the worst endings, and you won't really know why. And when I say there's multiple endings, what I really mean is that it plays the same exact video clips, but the voiceover changes, and that's it. It just screams of a feature they didn't really know what to do with, so they threw it into the game and said, it's good enough, right? But it's really not good enough. In fact, absolutely none of this game is good enough, not even the geomod technology, which surprisingly enough is not anywhere near as impressive as it was in the original game. I mean, sure, the opportunities for using the environment's destructibility are a bit more commonplace, but this game's even more linear than Red Faction 1 was, and the scope of what you can actually destroy using the geomod technology is actually quite a lot more limited. And the thing is, while you can understand that they wouldn't necessarily know how to do things with the original Red Faction, by the time they got to a sequel, they should have had a much better idea of what to do with it, and there's really no excuse here. In fact, when you look at the game as a whole, it really is a downgrade in almost every single regard compared to the original game, to the point where it actually ends up being a pretty awful game overall. It's like they learned absolutely nothing from the original Red Faction, and in fact probably set out to make a completely different game, but just ended up rebranding this to Red Faction 2 in the middle of development when they were trying to rush things out the door. And between the dumpster fire that is the writing in this game, and the extremely short campaign length, and the mechanics that just don't work anywhere near as well as they should, you ultimately end up with a game that really does scream of being rushed out the door to make a quick buck off of the Red Faction license, and not actually an attempt at making a proper sequel that expands and improves upon things that came before. I mean, they couldn't even really be bothered to put multiplayer into the PC version at all, although it's pretty baffling that they put the bot match mode in there, because why would you bother with that unless you're going to put multiplayer in there? Regardless, the multiplayer was split screen on consoles and it worked well enough, but it was a pretty bland and boring multiplayer experience, and it's all because of the mechanics of the game just not being any good. And as a result of all of this, the game is just a very poor quality release overall, and I cannot give it anything higher than a 1.5 out of 5. It is a distinct regression in nearly every single regard compared to the original game, and it's such a massive regression that it just ends up being an absolutely awful experience as a whole. I mean, they couldn't even do the geomod technology justice. It only allows you to destroy some walls here and there, and that's just not anywhere near as impressive as the massive terrain deformation you could do in the original game, which is just completely baffling. There is absolutely no reason to bother with Red Faction 2. If you're going to jump into Red Faction, the first game is still worth playing. And you can certainly get some enjoyment out of that if you're a first-person shooter fan, especially if you're willing to put up with some of the game's eccentricities and some of its problems. But Red Faction 2 is just not worth bothering with at all. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review or additional equipment or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.